Joining me now to discuss Democratic Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, who sits on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Coons, it's always wonderful to see you. Thank you very much for being here. The President of the United States says that there's a memorandum of understanding, a deal of some sort that's about to be signed. Iran says that that's not the case. What is your understanding of what is true?
Well, I'll believe it when I see it, Kasie, because in the 100 days since President Trump launched this war of choice against Iran, he's changed once, twice, three times. What's the goal of the war? And in the last few weeks, he's announced we were on the verge of a peace deal once, twice, three times. So I no longer believe President Trump when he says we are about to close a deal with Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz. My core questions, if there is a deal, will be how much money is being transferred to Iran out of its frozen assets? What sort of security are we getting that their nuclear enrichment program is genuinely under control? Because both of these things were, and is the Strait of Hormuz permanently open with no control by Iran, no right to charge tolls, no sovereignty recognized? Look, that would get us back to where we were before this war started. And President Trump said repeatedly, this was a war launched to change the regime. We did, in fact, kill much of the leadership, but Ayatollah 2.0, the son of the former Ayatollah, is in power now, as is the IRGC, and more brutally repressive of the people of Iran. Iran has demonstrated their willingness and ability to launch missiles and drones at all of our Gulf allies and to hit our bases and our embassies. And that's caused a lot of disruption, not just in the Persian Gulf, but in the world. And Americans are seeing a price at the pump and the grocery store that's a result. Obviously, I hope there is a successful end to this war. That would be a positive thing for the American people and the world economy. But at what cost? Tens of billions of dollars, more than 13 Americans killed and many hundreds wounded. And bluntly, we may be no better off than we were in 2017 when under Obama's nuclear deal, we had an open Strait of Hormuz, inspectors in Iran, and real limits on their nuclear program. I hope we will at least get back to that point with whatever deal President Trump agrees to.
All right. I also want to ask you, sir, about Jay Clayton, the president's announced pick to be the head of the Director of National Intelligence. Would you consider supporting his nomination? Is he someone who is qualified for this role?
Well, look, he does not meet the statutory requirement of having significant experience in intelligence and national security. I voted against him as head of the SEC. He is a seasoned and capable Wall Street lawyer and is currently the U.S. attorney in one of the most important national security related districts, the Southern District of New York. So he may not be as bad as Bill Pulte, but Bill Pulte is wildly unqualified. And his only qualification was a willingness to weaponize confidential mortgage data against President Trump's perceived enemies. An initial search for Jay Clayton, I just in the last few minutes have been trying to get up to speed on what he's been saying about elections and about Trump's perceived enemies. And I believe he has spoken positively about the $1.7 billion weaponization fund, which was also the cause for bipartisan pushback. So I am open to looking at his record, but we should not have Bill Pulte as the interim or acting DNI. That is a terrible idea. The deputy DNI, the person who was Tulsi Gabbard's deputy, should be the acting. He's actually a career professional with real intelligence experience. And given the first topic we were just discussing, that we're in the middle of a war with Iran, the world's greatest sponsor of state terrorism, we are at a heightened risk for an attack on the United States. The whole reason the Director of National Intelligence position was created after 9/11 was to coordinate all the streams of intelligence across the 17 other intelligence agencies to make sure that we see a future attack coming. This is not a time for us to play fast and loose and for the president to keep throwing different names at the Congress to try and placate the bipartisan opposition to Bill Pulte. I will give Jay Clayton a close review, but in the meantime, we must have someone as acting DNI who's got the relevant experience and is not a partisan hack.
Sir, fair enough. I also wanted to ask you about politics because so much, of course, depends on control of Congress here in the fall. And we saw Maine voters make a choice on Tuesday and select Graham Plattner as the nominee in Maine to run against Susan Collins. Are you willing to campaign with Mr. Plattner this fall?
Look, Kasie, I've got my own reelection campaign to focus on, and I have lots of current colleagues who I am helping and supporting, whether it's Sherrod Brown, who is seeking to return to his seat, or others like Mark Warner, who I am campaigning with and supporting. I know Susan Collins. I've worked with her, and I understand and respect why the voters of Maine have chosen someone who is an outspoken, forceful progressive, someone who is a combat veteran, and brings a new direction for the state of Maine if he were to be elected. But I've had real concerns about his tattoo and his story about what he thought or didn't think about this Nazi-affiliated tattoo and some of the allegations about his personal conduct. At the end of the day, I think the voters of Maine made it pretty clear that they wanted national Democrats to stay out of their primary and make up their own minds. They pushed back on Janet Mills, I think, because Democrats in Maine perceived her as having been supported by the National Democratic Party. So I think I should stay out of Maine politics and focus on my own state and my own region.
Sounds like your schedule's a little too busy in the fall for Mr. Plattner. It's kind of what I took away from that. All right, Senator Chris Coons, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, sir. I hope you come back soon.
Thank you, Kasie.
All right, we'll be